Hey guys, I came back from buying milk, just as promised. If you haven't watched the engine misconceptions video, make sure to watch it after this one, but here's a transmission video that I totally intended to make. Okay, so the first one we'll talk about is people who say stuff like, you never need to change clutch/trans fluid/flushing is a myth. Manual or automatic, all car transmissions use some kind of fluid, and it needs to be changed at set intervals. Each transmission will use different kinds of fluid, so check your manual accordingly for which one, or just Google forums. I'm sure we've heard about people like your grandma who think car engine oil lasts forever, but while most of us know engines need oil that needs to be changed, a great majority of modern car owners actually completely neglect to use the same logic when it comes to transmission fluid changing. The main culprit of this is that they usually say, oh, well, transmission systems are sealed. And sure, modern automatic transmissions are sealed systems, but nothing is perfectly airtight. Humidity, molecules, vapor, and whatnot can all still pass through a sealed system over time. Another thing that you need to think about is even if that sealed system was completely impermeable, fluid that's inside of the system is still being used for something. It's a wear item. Its viscosity will naturally change over time. It's going to get more sludgy and less effective and collect more heat and not travel as quickly throughout your vehicle systems. And that's the reality of life, is that nothing lasts forever. If you're a car enthusiast, you might even have to change yours every 40,000 miles, or in my case, even every 25,000 miles. If you race your car, you might even do it at the end of every session. However, for non-car people watching, 5 years or 60,000 miles, that's good enough. Like, you don't need to do it too often. If your Sony's a bit terrified, like, hey, I've got a car for 100, 120, even 140,000 miles, never saw the service record that said that the previous owner did it, my car's driving a bit rough, my recommendation is just flush it now. Don't worry too much about it. It's better late than never. And you'll notice the worlds of a difference when you shift when you do flush it. It's only like $100 to $240 depending on what car it is. So it's cheap enough where you should just go ahead and do it, especially if your mileage is that high. And some people will try to scare you by saying, oh, well, permanent damage has already been done to your engine by flushing it that late. They're not technically wrong, but here's my pro gamer move for that. As long as you do finally get around to flushing it, you will fix most of your car's rough acceleration and lurching shifts. And yeah, while it does technically have a shorter lifespan, it's probably marginal depending on how long you're keeping the car. That's just a very fancy way of me saying, make it the next owner's problem. If you do it at 120,000 miles for your first flush ever, you're definitely way behind service interval, but even with the permanent damage in consideration, your car will probably still make it to 200, 220, even 240,000 miles. And if it puffs its last puff around 250,000, hopefully you've sold it by then. So don't think too hard about this one. Just make sure you get around to doing it. And any future vehicles you intend to own, make sure you keep up with the intervals. Never hold gear when stopped. This is a pretty common myth, mostly for the sake of reliability or just developing a good driving behavior. Keeping a motorcycle or car in gear at stops, there's nothing inherently wrong with that as long as you're aware of the fact that you're in gear. It's annoying for beginners, yes, because they might stall, but it's perfectly fine for the vehicle's health. It might add some extra clutch wear, but depending on where you live, like San Francisco, Atlanta, or anywhere else in the world, like the Himalayas even, if it's a very mountainous or very hilly region, this is just an inevitability that you'll have to deal with, because there are situations where I recommend staying in gear during stops, like inclined intersections, waiting at a traffic light that's on a hill, or when you've arrived at a destination, you still want to park it in gear, especially if it's on a sloped area. Even without inclines though, it's not the end of the world if you park your car in gear on flat areas, but there is something you need to keep in mind. When you go to start your vehicle up the next time, make sure you remember that it's in gear, or put it back into neutral before you start it, because when you try to start cars that are in gear, they'll either stall, worst case scenario, they might even go through a wall. For motorcycles, this is a much lesser concern, as if you start them in gear, most of them will just stall instantly. The ones that do have enough torque to lurch them forward will only just be a few inches, and that's it. I know this video is about cars, but because the engineering of cars and bikes are pretty similar, I want to add a quick tidbit of advice for them, because it is going to differ for cars. From an engineering standpoint, they're not too different, with exception being that most motorcycles lack a handbrake, except a Honda Goldwing, because the Honda Goldwing is just a freaking car on two wheels. Otherwise, they behave pretty similarly when they're in gear and when they're in neutral, but there's a very cruel reality that motorcyclists need to keep in mind, especially for motorcyclists in America. A lot of Americans don't really see motorcyclists, so it's better to stay in gear at stops and intersections in case you need to react to something happening instead of fumbling for your shifter, because I don't want to become an SUV sandwich. And also, a lot of Americans use those self-driving systems like Mercedes or Teslas that have those. They read your taillights to see how far or close you are to them. They don't read motorcycle taillights correctly compared to cars. Fortnite has a whole video talking about this that unfortunately documents a tragedy, and I've actually had a few instances in Atlanta where I've seen people using these systems. I'll see their drivers quickly manually hit their brakes. I'll literally see the panic form in their eyes, but by then I've also moved my bike out of harm's way. And it sucks that I have to think of that, but I recommend motorcyclists stay in gear when they're stopped. Just park in gear, stop in gear, and wear your gear. Not that kind of gear, this kind of gear. Moving on. Manual transmissions aren't more fun than automatics. Shh, okay, alright. So I know a few videos ago, I just said I don't mind which transmission choice you make. That you can own an auto, manual, CVT, torque converter, I wouldn't tease you. And by the way, that still holds true. Buy whatever transmission you want. However, if we're talking about fun, raw engagement, come on, slappy paddles, that ain't the same. Nothing compares to slamming things into gears. Click, click, clunk, clunk, whoa, manuals, bro, they're so much more fun. This ain't no myth, they're de facto cooler. You know what else is cool though? Subscribing to this channel. Please, I'm so close to 600k. It's free, it's fun, I promise, just subscribe. Manual is faster / more fuel efficient than automatic. So this one is a yes and no myth, because even though I agree that manuals are more fun and engaging than automatics, one thing I will concede is that they are no longer de facto faster than automatics, especially modern DCTs, or heck, even 8-speed or 10-speed torque converters are giving manuals a run for their money. The general rule of thumb is that vehicles made 2010 and prior, the manuals will usually be about as the same as automatics. Vehicles made 2000 and prior, the manuals will be better than the automatics, but vehicles made 2011 and onwards, the automatic is actually going to be the more efficient one, both from a fuel economy standpoint and from a speed standpoint. Now, few exceptions do exist to this rule, like Subarus, for example. Their WRX and the BRZ, which is just an 8.6 platform, have the manuals still a whole second faster than their automatic counterparts, but that's more of a fault of Subaru not investing in better automatic transmission technology, but let's just say some companies have made better ones than others, because again, it depends on how much they invest in it, how much R&D they do on it, and so on and so forth. Overall, however, the rapid advancement of automatic gearboxes and computer technology have created a perfect storm where human input is now consistently outmatched by our inevitable robot overlords. The engine is the most expensive part of the car. This is the final myth of this video, and a lot of non-car people think this, but depending on the model of your car, the actual answer might be your transmission. Also, a note I'd like to add is that while the engine may cost more on paper to outright buy, the labor involved to replace a transmission usually exceeds the labor involved in replacing an engine, and I'll explain that a bit later in this entry. But basically, on modern day vehicles, especially like I mentioned in the earlier one from 2010 onwards, a lot of transmission technology has rapidly advanced, which also comes as a double-edged sword. They're more efficient, sure, but now they have more parts, more computers, more electronics, more software, so modern transmissions have well over 43 components that aren't just physically located in the housing anymore. They have lots of other modules that are communicating with it, sending information to it, and blah blah blah, where like for over a century transmissions really only had 10 parts to them. So the reason a lot of people still buy manuals to save money compared to automatics isn't just because their fuel economy is, even though it's not as good as automatics anymore, the lack of components inside of them and the widespread part availability makes them a lot easier to fix and a lot cheaper to replace. But to really make you understand why transmissions are also expensive compared to engines is that the transmission is the main reason anything on your car works. It's the one transmitting engine power through the drivetrain and putting power to the ground, hence the name transmission. Let's use human anatomy as an example. The engine is the easiest one to compare. It's your heart, it's your power source. The intake is like your lungs, it's the one breathing in air. The tires, wheels, and axles are like your feet, thighs, and leg muscles. The ECU is the car's brain. But the transmission, that's the spine. It's possible to get a heart transplant, even lung transplants. Those are very common in fact. But a spine transplant, you know, some disc at a time can be replaced, but outright changing a whole spine, we're not David from Cyberpunk. We can't chrome the F up. Spinal damage, even if it can be fixed by transplants or be performed by a transplant, is not as common as heart transplants and may not have the guaranteed long-term sustainability. There are some patients with spine damage who still remain permanently paralyzed, even in spite of constant transplant attempts. You know, our knowledge of the nervous system and really the human body in general is still quite limited. So I do guess cars have one advantage, which is that we created them, so we obviously know how to fix them, but we did not create ourselves. Nature did. Ayo, Mother Nature, DMS our schematics real quick. Anyways, hopefully this illustrated how important your vehicle's transmission is, being the spine for your car. It's the most expensive component to fix, the most labor-intensive component to replace and even to swap. And every car enthusiast ever who's aware of that concept of engine swapping and the memes around it sometimes fail to realize that certain vehicles don't have a transmission capable of handling the new power, and boom, it breaks. Now, of course, you can just swap the transmission too to meet the new engine swap power, but this is not an easy task because unlike engines where you can just reorganize your engine bay to fit even a Lamborghini V12, most transmission tunnels are very hard to alter. The chassis and frame around that area is also very difficult and haphazardous to cut because when you start cutting that area or reducing its structural rigidity, you're violating a lot of safety and inspection laws. And I know someone's gonna shrug and be like, well, who cares about the law? Again, you should care about your own safety in the event of a collision, or a more realistic thing that I know car guys will care about is when it comes to racing, like SCCA and NHRA, a lot of them actually do tech inspections of your car. And major frame alteration, especially for vehicles that are 10 seconds and under, you're actually expected to have roll cages and a really stiff chassis. If you're doing the exact opposite and cutting your frame or doing major frame altercations that reduce its rigidity and reduce the safety of it, you will actually not pass these tech inspections and be disqualified from being track worthy. So if you don't care about safety, if you don't care about the law, but you do care about racing, this is still something you have to think about. TLDR, take care of your transmission. And if you do need to swap it, make sure you check compatibility. It's always better to go with something that fits in your tunnel as is than, the simpler it is, the better is what I'm trying to say. Don't go around messing with your frame and chassis. Having said that though, I hope you learned a lot from this video. Subscribe if you like automotive content, and go check out the first part of this video if you haven't already. Other than that, thanks for watching, and see you all next time.